It started with a thud. A can of soup hit the floor in aisle 4, then another, then the sound of someone gasping in pain. Jason Statham, 57, known for his action films, was just there to buy eggs and tea bags. He wore a cap low over his eyes. No one noticed him, but he noticed everything. He looked up and saw an elderly man, thin, shaking, trying to pick up cans that had rolled everywhere. His military cap read, U.S. Army, Korea veteran. 3 young men nearby laughed out loud. "Need help, Grandpa?" one sneered. Another fake limped, dragging his foot. "Oops, war injury." The third whistled like a bomb falling. "Incoming!" Jason's jaw locked, his hands curled into fists, but he didn't move. Not yet. The veteran, barely able to bend, tried to smile. "I'm all right, boys." But Jason could see it. The shame, the pain, the loneliness. Everyone in the store saw it. No one did a thing, not even the cashier, who looked away. That's when Jason stepped forward. Not fast, not loud, just steady. Because some of the loudest punches in life come without sound. The old man struggled to pick up the last can. His back bent slowly, carefully, like it was made of glass. Jason knelt down beside him, quiet. "Let me," he said softly. The veteran looked surprised, then smiled. "Thank you, son." Jason picked up the can and gently placed it in the man's basket. The boys kept laughing. "Wow, look who's here. The bald guy from those car movies," one chuckled. "Yeah," said another. "What's he gonna do? Drive us into a wall?" Jason stood up slowly, his face calm, eyes sharp. "You don't know who you're mocking," he said. One of the boys rolled his eyes. Yeah, war hero. Big deal." Jason looked at the veteran. "What's your name, sir?" "Harold. Harold Mason," the man replied. Jason nodded, then turned to the boys. "Harold fought in Korea when he was 19. Got frostbite so bad he lost half his right foot. Came home to an empty street. No parade, no welcome." The boys fell silent. Jason's voice grew lower. "And the worst part? He's still getting hurt. But this time, by people who've never fought for anything." You could hear a pin drop. The store was quiet now. Even the workers had stopped moving. A woman near the bakery held her chest, her eyes glassy. Jason placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. Harold smiled again, but it was weak. "I've seen worse. Doesn't mean it hurts less." Jason turned to the boys again. "Do you think it's funny? A man who can barely walk, but still shows more strength than you ever have?" One of them laughed nervously. "It's just a joke, man." Jason stepped closer, slow and calm. "My father was a diver," he said. "Toughest man I knew. He worked with his hands, not cameras. I was bullied too when I was younger. Called names, laughed at, even beaten." He paused. "But he taught me something I never forgot." "What's that?" one of them asked, voice shaky. Jason looked him dead in the eyes. "Never laugh at someone's pain, unless you've felt it yourself." The boy lowered his eyes. No one spoke. Harold stood a little straighter, and the world, for one moment, stood still. Jason stood firm. The 3 boys looked smaller now, unsure. The tallest one, Liam, cleared his throat and said, "Look, we didn't mean anything." Jason raised his hand gently. "You did." His voice wasn't angry, it was tired, deep. "You laughed at a man who gave his youth to protect yours. You mocked a limp that came from crawling under fire." Harold looked down. Jason turned to him. "You don't deserve this." Harold smiled sadly. "Son, this ain't the first time." Jason's eyes welled. It should have been the last. Then something unexpected happened. The second boy, Tommy, stepped forward. I didn't know he was a veteran, I swear." "You shouldn't need to know," Jason said. "Respect shouldn't have to be earned. It should be given." Tommy wiped his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir." Harold gave a small nod. "Thank you." The smallest boy in the back was already crying. Jason watched him closely. Sometimes the loudest kids are the most broken inside. And Jason knew that feeling all too well. Jason and Harold sat quietly near the front exit, away from the crowd. Harold pulled something small from his pocket, a faded photo and a small medal on a ribbon. "She mailed this to me," Harold said, holding up the medal. "My wife said I'd earned it." Jason looked closely. It was a Purple Heart. "You didn't wear it?" Jason asked. Harold shook his head. Didn't feel right. The ones who didn't come back, they deserved it more. Jason swallowed hard. "That's how my father was," he said. "Quiet, brave, never bragged." Jason stared at the medal. "You know, in films I've fought 100 men. I've flown cars, escaped explosions, but nothing is harder than living with pain that no one sees." Harold looked at him. "You know that pain?" Jason nodded. "More than you think." He paused, then said slowly, "My brother died in my arms when I was 23. Cancer." I held his hand when the machine beeped for the last time. Harold's face fell. Jason whispered, "I'd trade all my movies for just one more minute with him." Silence filled the space. Even the automatic doors stopped moving. Someone at the checkout whispered, "That's Jason Statham." Within minutes, a quiet crowd gathered around aisle 4. No one pulled out phones. No one laughed. They just watched. Jason stood beside Harold. "I know what grief feels like," he said. "And I know what regret feels like too." The 3 boys, now standing near the frozen foods, looked pale, not out of fear, but out of something heavier. Truth. The oldest one, Liam, stepped forward again. "My grandpa was in Vietnam. He died before I got to say goodbye. I guess I never really thought about it like this." Jason nodded. "It's easier not to think, but kindness takes effort." Harold looked at Liam. "What was his name?" James O'Connor." Harold smiled. "I knew him. We served on the same ship. He was a good man." Liam's lips trembled. "You did?" Harold nodded again. "He had a picture of you in his wallet." That was it. The boy fell to his knees, sobbing. I didn't know. Jason helped him up. "Now you do." And in the corner of the store, near the register, a single cashier wiped her eyes. This was more than just groceries now. Jason sat quietly on a bench near the front window. Outside, the sky had turned gray. Rain tapped lightly on the glass. Harold sat beside him, holding his small bag of groceries and the Purple Heart medal. The store was silent. Even the music had stopped. One of the boys, Liam, was still wiping tears from his face. Jason looked at him and said gently, "There's something I've never said out loud. Not on TV, not in interviews, not even in my films." Everyone leaned in, listening. "I had a brother. His name was Lee. He was older, stronger, smarter. He believed in people, even when they didn't believe in him." Harold turned to look at him. "He died when I was 23, not in war, not in an accident. He took his own life after leaving the army. Said he didn't feel like a man anymore. Said he was tired of being invisible." Jason's voice cracked. "I was too busy chasing dreams to notice he was drowning." The crowd stood still. Some cried quietly. "I carry that name in silence," Jason whispered. "And every time I see someone ignored or mocked, I see him." And that's when Harold reached for Jason's hand and held it. Harold looked at Jason's hand and paused. There, just below the sleeve of his shirt, was a small, faded tattoo. It wasn't a movie tattoo. It wasn't for show. It was the name Lee, inked in shaky black letters. "You had that done for him?" Harold asked. Jason nodded slowly. "I was 24. I didn't want anyone to forget him." One of the customers, a woman in her 70s, stepped forward. "I lost my husband in 71, she said, her voice shaking. "He was never the same after Vietnam. People didn't understand back then." Jason looked at her kindly. "They still don't. But that's why we speak now." Another man near the bakery said, "You're doing more than acting today, Jason. You're healing." Jason gave a small, sad smile. He looked at the boys and said, "One stupid joke can break a man who already feels broken." Liam nodded, tears in his eyes. "I wish I could take it back." Jason looked at him. "You can't take it back, but you can change what you do next." And for the first time, Harold looked up with hope in his eyes, because something was changing, not just in the store, but in their hearts. Jason helped Harold back into a seat. He looked tired now. His hand trembled just slightly as he held onto the bench. "Are you all right?" Jason asked softly. Harold gave a slow nod. "I'm fine, just thinking." Jason smiled gently. "You've earned the right to rest, Harold." But then Harold said something no one expected. "My son died in 1986, in a place called Beirut." The store fell silent again. He was 22, a U.S. Marine, stepped on something he never saw, gone in seconds. Jason sat back. His eyes welled up again. "I never talk about him. People forgot, even my neighbors, they just moved on." The oldest woman in the store, maybe 80, began to cry softly in aisle 2. Harold looked at the young men. That's why it hurt today, not just the jokes, but knowing that even his memory was mocked. Tommy, the second boy, dropped to one knee and said, "I swear to you, I'll never laugh at anyone's pain again." Harold looked down, and for the first time in years, he let a tear fall. Jason placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "We didn't forget," Jason said. And in that moment, no one in that store ever would again. Just as Harold finished speaking, a quiet voice came from behind the milk shelves. "Excuse me, I know that name. Mason?" Everyone turned. An older man stepped out from the back corner. He wore a long coat, white hair tucked under a cap. He held a small American flag in his hand. "I served with a William Mason in Beirut. He was kind, never left a man behind. He saved my life." Harold's eyes widened. "That was my son." The man stepped closer, gently shaking. "I always wondered what happened to his family. I tried finding you, for years." Harold stood slowly. "You knew him?" "I owe him everything," the man said, voice breaking. Everyone in the store stood still, watching this unbelievable moment. Jason stepped back, giving them space. His eyes were wet again. The two men hugged, and it wasn't a small hug. It was the kind of hug that carries 40 years of pain. Jason turned to the boys. "This is why we don't mock strangers. You never know the story behind the limp, or the scar, or the silence." Liam looked down, ashamed again. The world had just shifted in aisle 6, and no one would leave the same. Jason watched as Harold and the other veteran, Mr. Sandler, shared stories. They spoke quietly, like brothers meeting after decades apart. Jason felt a tap on his shoulder. It was the cashier, tears in her eyes. "Sir, I know who you are, but today, you're more than an actor." Jason gave a soft smile. "Thank you." She continued, "Do you believe in God's timing?" Jason paused, then nodded. "I do now." He turned back to Harold and said gently, "You weren't alone today. I think someone wanted you to be seen." Harold smiled. "My wife always told me I had an angel guarding me. Maybe today he just sent backup." Jason sat next to him again. Sometimes we think we're forgotten, but someone always remembers. Harold looked Jason in the eyes. You remembered your brother. That matters. Jason nodded. It's why I don't fight with fists anymore. I fight with memory. Then something happened no one expected. Jason reached into his coat and pulled out a folded note. I wrote this years ago, for my brother, but I think it's meant for you too. He handed it to Harold, and everyone leaned in, because something in the air had changed. Harold unfolded the note carefully. His hands shook as he read. It was written in Jason's handwriting. Simple, honest, raw. To the one I miss the most. I didn't say goodbye the right way. I didn't say enough. You were always stronger, kinder, braver. I've worn fake armor in movies, but you wore real courage in silence. I will carry your name until the end of my days, and I hope, somewhere, you're proud. Tears fell from Harold's cheeks. He passed the note to Mr. Sandler, who wiped his eyes, then to Liam, then to the rest of the boys. Each one cried harder than the last. Even the store manager came over and read it, then quietly said, "We'll frame this. It'll stay right here." Jason nodded. It's not for fame. It's for every forgotten soul who ever gave everything and was left behind. Harold whispered, "He would be proud of you." Jason looked at him. "I just wanted to buy eggs today," he said softly. Everyone chuckled through their tears, but deep down, they knew. This moment was meant to happen, and no one in that store would forget it, ever. Harold carefully held the letter Jason had written. Then slowly, he pulled something out of his own coat. It was an old, crumpled envelope, yellow with age. He handed it to Jason. This was my son's last letter to me. I've never read it out loud before." Jason opened it gently, treating it like gold. He began to read in a quiet voice. "Dear Dad, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. But I want you to know, I wasn't scared. I was proud. I served beside brave men. I carried your strength with me. I hope I made you proud. Tell Mom I love her. And tell the world to be kind again. We've forgotten how to see each other." Jason stopped. His throat tightened. The boys all looked down, hands over their faces. No more jokes, no more pride, just silence and tears. Jason folded the letter carefully and placed it back into Harold's hand. "You raised a hero," Jason whispered. Harold closed his eyes. "I just wish he could have grown old enough to walk with a limp too." And everyone cried with him. Just as the emotions settled, the store doors opened again. A black SUV pulled up. Out stepped a man in a dark suit with an earpiece. Everyone turned. 2 more men followed, standing tall. They looked like Secret Service. Then, slowly, a woman stepped in. Tall, graceful, composed. It was Melania Trump. Someone whispered, "Is that really her?" Melania walked straight toward Harold and Jason. "I was told what happened here," she said softly, "and I came to say thank you." Harold blinked in shock. "Thank you?" Melania nodded. "You served your country. My husband always said, never forget the forgotten. That includes heroes like you." She pulled out a small box from her purse and handed it to him. Harold opened it slowly. Inside was a gold pin. It read, "Honor still lives here." Jason looked surprised too. Melania turned to him. "And thank you, Mr. Statham. You didn't fight with violence. You fought with truth." Jason nodded, still speechless. And for the first time in years, Harold cried with pride. Even the bullies stood straight, hands over their hearts. Because this wasn't just a moment, it was a healing. After Melania left, the store returned to silence again. Jason noticed the smallest of the 3 boys, Noah,
sitting on the floor near the checkout, still crying softly. Jason knelt beside him. "How old are you?" he asked gently. 15, Noah sniffled. "Where's your dad?" The boy hesitated. "He left when I was 6. My mom works 2 jobs. I guess I got angry." Jason nodded slowly. "I was angry too when I lost my brother. I broke things. I pushed people away. But hurting others doesn't heal you." Noah wiped his face. "I didn't mean to hurt him." Jason placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then make it right, not with words, with how you live from now on." Harold stepped forward and looked at Noah. "My son died young. I don't have grandkids, but maybe I can be someone to you." Noah looked up, surprised. "You mean that?" Harold smiled. "Only if you're ready to be better." Noah stood and hugged Harold tightly. For a boy who needed a father, and for a man who needed a son, that hug changed everything.
2 hours had passed since Jason entered the grocery store, but no one had left. The manager quietly walked to the back office and returned with a blank corkboard. He set it up near the entrance, right next to aisle 1. He placed a sign above it, "The Wall of Honor, for those we forgot to thank." Jason nodded with respect. That's a start. One by one, people began writing names on small cards. Fathers, brothers, friends, husbands, wives. All veterans, all gone. Harold added his son's name, William Mason, age 22, Beirut, 1983. Jason stood beside him and finally wrote one name of his own, Lee Statham, 1965, 1988. My brother, my guide. The boys also came forward. Liam wrote his grandfather's name. Tommy wrote the name of a neighbor who'd once saved a child in a fire. Even little Noah, still holding Harold's hand, wrote, "To the father I never had, but just found today." The wall filled quickly. Tears filled every eye. Jason looked around the store, now quiet, still, and full of something that couldn't be explained. Respect had returned, and something sacred had been restored. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were slowly clearing, and light poured through the front windows of the store. Jason looked up and exhaled. Harold stood beside him, arm around Noah's shoulder. Jason turned to him and said quietly, "You gave this store something today, Harold." Harold chuckled. "I think we both did." But Jason grew quiet again. He looked away for a second, then spoke with a heavy heart. "There's one thing I wish I could go back and change," he said. Harold nodded gently. "What's that?" Jason's eyes filled with tears. "I wish I had told my brother I loved him, just once. I thought I had time." Harold placed a hand on his shoulder. "You just did," he said. Noah looked up. "You helped me say it too. I never told my mom thank you for holding us together." Jason looked at the boy and nodded. "Then go home and say it. Don't wait like I did." The boy hugged him. Jason hugged back. And in that moment, 3 generations healed. Not with fists, not with fame, but with the kind of truth that stays with you forever. The next morning, the video went viral. Over 92 million views in 24 hours. Headlines read, "Jason Statham silently breaks a nation's heart. Veteran meets stranger and finds a grandson." Words that changed a grocery store and the world. Jason gave no interview. He didn't post about it. He simply returned to his quiet life. But across the country, something began to change. Grocery stores added honor walls. Kids asked their grandparents about old medals. Families finally said things they had left unsaid for decades. And at the center of it all was one simple truth. Kindness doesn't need a camera. It needs a moment and someone brave enough to speak. Jason stood outside the same store a week later, looking at the now full wall of honor. Harold stood beside him. Noah was laughing with his mother, hand in hand. Jason smiled. You never know when a trip for eggs becomes a trip that changes lives, he said softly. Harold nodded. God doesn't send us to aisles, he sends us to people. Jason put on his cap and walked away. And the world? The world didn't forget. Dear friends, if this story moved your heart, even a little, please give it a like. If you cried like we did, hit subscribe. And most of all, leave a comment below with a name you want the world to remember. A veteran, a father, a brother, a mother, a hero. Let's fill this page with names that deserve to be seen. Because like Jason said, sometimes the loudest message comes in silence. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.